I never thought love would come to me the way it did. Unexpected, imperfect, and wrapped in the complexities of someone else's past. When I met David, he was a man healing from a difficult divorce, trying to balance the responsibilities of fatherhood with the longing to rebuild his life. I was in my mid-30s, independent, and convinced that if I ever settled down, it would be with someone who came with a clean slate. But love doesn't always follow rules. And neither does life. David had a son, Ethan. He was 11 when I first met him, quiet, observant, and a little guarded. I didn't expect him to welcome me with open arms, and he didn't. But I didn't take it personally. I knew that in his world, I was just another adult trying to wedge her way into something sacred, his relationship with his father. So, I took it slow. I started with simple things. I learned his favorite snack, watched the same shows he liked, and made sure to respect the invisible boundary he seemed to carry around like armor. Over time, he began to soften just a little. He would sit beside me on the couch instead of across the room. He started asking me questions, small ones at first, what I did for work, what kind of music I liked. And when I would cook dinner, he'd hover in the kitchen, pretending to be uninterested but clearly watching. David noticed the change too. "You're good with him," he'd say, often with a mix of pride and surprise. It made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I was doing something right. We got married in the spring. It was a small ceremony, nothing extravagant. Ethan stood beside his father as the best man, stiff in his little suit but trying hard to look grown up. I'll never forget the way he looked at me when I said my vows. There was a hint of acceptance in his eyes, a flicker of something warm. And I held on to that with everything I had. But as the seasons changed, so did everything else. Ethan's mother, Melissa, began to re-enter the picture in ways that felt invasive. Their custody agreement had always been clear. David had primary custody, and Melissa had scheduled visitation every other weekend. She had moved out of state 2 years earlier, pursuing a new relationship and, by all accounts, a new life. But now she was back, and suddenly she wanted more time, more involvement, more say. At first, we tried to be accommodating. David was always one to avoid conflict, and I respected that. She's his mother, he'd say, and he deserves to have her in his life. I agreed. But there's a difference between co-parenting and chaos. And Melissa didn't seem to know the difference. She would show up unannounced, often during school nights, claiming she just wanted to see him. Sometimes she'd bring gifts, loud and flashy toys or gadgets that disrupted his routine and distracted him from school. Other times, she'd come bearing stories about how we were trying to turn him against her. "They don't want you to love me," she told him once. I found out when Ethan came home crying, asking why we didn't like his mom. That night, I sat on his bed and tried to explain that love doesn't have to be divided. "There's room for all of us, Ethan," I told him. "But love also needs rules, boundaries, so that everyone feels safe." I wanted to believe that logic would win, that if we were consistent, kind, and firm, Melissa would eventually respect the space we were trying to build. But it only got worse. She began accusing me of trying to replace her. "You're not his mother," she snapped during one particularly tense exchange outside our home. "You'll never be." I didn't respond, not because I agreed, but because I knew Ethan was watching from the window. I didn't want him to see me fight. I didn't want to become one of the adults who used him as a weapon in their war. Over time, Melissa's presence became more manipulative. She'd whisper things to Ethan that made him question everything: our rules, our choices, our love. He started pulling away. He became angry, resentful, and defiant. He'd say things like, "My mom lets me," or "You're not my real family." Each word felt like a dagger. But I held on. I kept showing up. I made his favorite meals even when he wouldn't eat them. I left little notes in his backpack, telling him I believed in him. I attended every parent-teacher meeting, every soccer game, every awkward middle school play, even when he barely acknowledged me. One evening, after a particularly rough week of tension, Ethan came home from a visit with Melissa and locked himself in his room. I knocked gently, waited, and when he finally opened the door, I saw the tears in his eyes. "She said you hate her," he whispered. She said you want her gone. I knelt beside him and looked him in the eye. I don't hate your mom, Ethan. But I do hate how confused and sad you feel. That's not fair to you. You deserve peace. You deserve a home where you don't feel like you have to choose. That was the night I realized something had to change. We couldn't keep tiptoeing around Melissa's chaos, hoping she'd one day respect the boundaries we were trying so hard to protect. David and I sat down and made a hard decision. We were going to pursue a court-reviewed revision of the custody agreement. Not to take Melissa out of Ethan's life, but to enforce clear, structured involvement that didn't upend his stability. It was a grueling process. Melissa fought tooth and nail, accusing us of alienation, of manipulation, of turning Ethan into a pawn. There were moments when I doubted everything, when I wondered if I was causing more harm than good. But every time I saw Ethan retreat into himself, every time I watched his eyes dart nervously when he heard her name, I knew we were doing the right thing. We were granted a revised agreement with strict visitation schedules and communication guidelines. Melissa was furious, but she eventually complied. With time, the chaos began to quiet. Ethan started smiling again. He began to trust the routine, to find comfort in the predictability of our home. He even started calling our house home, without hesitation. And slowly, so very slowly, he let me back in. One Saturday morning, as we made pancakes together, our little tradition, he looked up at me and said, "You don't try to be my mom. You just care about me. That's better." I didn't cry then, though every fiber of me wanted to. I just smiled and flipped the pancake. But later, in the quiet of the laundry room, I let the tears fall, not out of pain but relief. I realized that love isn't about replacing what was lost. It's about standing in the gap. It's about showing up when it's hard, staying when it's uncomfortable, and fighting for what's right, even when it's misunderstood. I wasn't Ethan's mother by birth, but I was his protector. I was the safe space when the world felt too loud. I was the steady hand when everything else felt like a storm. When boundaries were tested, when my role was questioned, my place challenged, I didn't give up. I fought for my family, not with anger or pride, but with love that refused to be shaken. Because families aren't born. Sometimes they're built, brick by brick, battle by battle, moment by moment. And in the end, that love, tested, tried, and true, was what held us all together.